Thank you so much for the introduction. 10,282 days ago, the World Wide Web became publicly available. It has profoundly influenced and directed the shape of our modern world. That familiar sound of dial-up, which I will not play for you, is a reminder of how the fastest growing communication medium of all time has shaped the global climate of how we connect with one another and interact with information. Since the launch of the web, we've seen this dramatic shift in the way that we produce and preserve information. And for almost 30 years, we've seen this exponential growth of digital content. And we can look to some example stats like the 4.5 billion internet users we have and the 1.5 billion websites, of which only 200 million are active. Not long after the web was launched, we saw this conscious effort to preserve born digital data in a process known as web archiving. And the first large-scale project to address preservation were initiated by Brewster Kahle and the Internet Archive, as well as national libraries in Sweden and Australia in 1996. When we discuss web archiving, we're talking about a practice in which can be understood as any form of deliberate and purposeful collecting and preserving of web material. And like any process or tool, web archiving comes with its own set of challenges. And of immediate concern is that while the web continues to grow, it is also disappearing. There is no backup to the internet. And as web pages disappear, we are at risk of losing potentially significant information. When we study topics from society and culture, politics, economic health, we rely on a variety of data sources, our primary or secondary or tertiary. And for scholars studying topics post-1996, web archives become an essential consideration as a data source for both their uniqueness and their richness. And so, in essence, web archives become this access point to explore our modern historical record. And they're distinguished from traditional historical sources in both scope and scale. So in terms of scope, we have scholars who are now approaching data sources that are inclusive of a more diverse range of voices. And in terms of scale, as noted by the late American historian Roy Rosenzweig, and something that our own primary investigator Ian Milligan dives into in his research, is that there's been this shift from an environment of scarcity to one of abundance. This atmosphere of abundance, however, also brings with it this overwhelming sense and at times an inability to cope with shifting through data. So for instance, the Internet Archive currently and alone has 50 petabytes worth of data, unique data, which amounts to billions of web pages. Researchers don't have the time, nor would I argue the inclination, to scan through thousands or hundreds of thousands of websites. So this is the context that we have. There's an extensive amount of born digital data that has been saved. Web archives are becoming an increasingly critical data source, but access remains a significant barrier for their use. And the reason for this is primarily due to scale, as well as the fact that understanding high-performance computing and the command line is by and large out of reach for most scholars. So the challenge and the question that we're left with is how do we reduce the barrier to access and use of web archives? I recognize that the terms I'm going to be using, access, usability, and usability, are influenced by the disciplines that we come from our life experience. So I'd just like to offer a few definitions as a starting point for our discussion. Access, we're talking about the freedom or ability to obtain or make use of something. Accessibility, I'm referring to capable of being reached, of being used, seen, understood. And finally, usability, we're talking about that quality or state of being usable or ease of use. And what I hope we can recognize together is that you can't look or talk about access without also acknowledging the vital role that usability plays. So this challenge of access is where the Archives Unleashed project comes in. It began when a historian, a librarian, and a computer scientist asked how web archives could be unlocked to support scholarly inquiry. Specifically, we've developed a number of platforms and tools with infrastructure that's capable of assisting in the scalable analysis of web archives. And over the past 2.5 years, we've been working with this guiding question of how do we meet the research needs, specifically for our colleagues in the digital humanities and social sciences, but also beyond. How do we meet those research needs, push the boundaries of analysis while still lowering this barrier to access? And while this answer is multifaceted, I'm going to be describing the ways in which we've consciously incorporated the spirit of access and usability to inform our project aspects. There are 4 main tools that fall under our umbrella. I'm going to be talking specifically to the cloud and the toolkit, but I'm happy to discuss all of those tools. So first, let's look at how themes of accessibility and usability are expressed in our code base and development. The Archives Unleashed toolkit is the core code to which all of our other platforms either build off of or interact with. It focuses on flexible analysis solutions when we work with the raw files that make up our web archive. And transparency has been a guiding force behind this development and really speaks to the accessibility component of our project. So transparency in the way that there are no black boxes. Researchers can literally see what requests are being made to inform, transform, extract, and analyze the information. And this is just a screenshot of our toolkit, what you'll see in command line. Secondly, our code base has always been and continues to be a publicly available free and open source tool, which means that anybody can access, anybody can use, and anybody is welcome to clone the repository and make use of the code. Finally, the code base is also built on practices that are widely accepted by those in the digital humanities field. So for example, the specific languages that we've built in. We've also expanded features to address growing areas of interest, such as image analysis. Second piece is the Archives Unleashed Cloud. As its name suggests, it is a cloud-based platform for web archives analysis, and it has 4 main components. So we have that auth code base. On the back end, we have Rails, and then we have that user face for our users. We've used the Usability data transfer API to make the connection between our platform and the data source. In terms of access, it enables individuals to access their work or their web archive collections through their Archivist subscription. So that's the data source that we're pulling from. And in terms of usability, it provides an interface that is both recognizable and familiar. So unlike Terminal or the command line, which can at first look very intimidating, individuals tend to be more comfortable with that click to results type task process. And so the development of the cloud was built to help extend usability and accessibility for our base code. And I'm just going to do a shout out to our co-PI and developer, Nick Rouet, who single-handedly created the cloud for this project, and our team is incredibly proud of his achievements with this. In our final year, we continue to look at ways that we can broaden access and usability, whether it's through developing additional features or extending interoperability with other web archiving platforms. So we have all these tools. But you're probably wondering, now how do we use them? And this is where documentation comes in. We recognize that there's always going to be a learning curve, no matter what platform, tool, service, process that you're using. But our goal with documentation has always been, how do we make that process as simplified and as painless as possible? When we first started approaching documentation, we had to acknowledge the very broad range of skills and experience that our users were bringing with them. So everything from their research interests, so from the historian to the social scientist, political scientists, journalism, as well as their technical backgrounds, so whether they were familiar with command line coding or whether this was something completely new to them, their experience with web archives themselves, as well as the resources that were made available to them. And so documentation for me has always been an area, both in this project and in other projects, that I've taken a great interest in, because I believe that documentation will always heavily impact usability. And so this guiding question for us has always been, how do we support encourage, empower, and instill confidence in scholars who are approaching new tools and methods. So this is what we've created. We've created documentation that speaks to that broad experience base. So we have the step-by-step instructions for new users. We also have more in-depth technical explanations for our experienced contributors. When we look at accessibility in terms of, we're also reminded of the various learning styles that our users bring with them. And so this is why you'll see different types of documentation. We have that text-based instructions included in our README files for our GitHub repository. We've also developed, with the help of 2 PhD candidates at the University of Waterloo, a series of learning resources. So again, those step-by-step instructions on how to use our tools as well as external tools. An area that I'm currently developing a little bit more is video-based tutorials, because sometimes it's just so much easier to see that exact step-by-step process replicated. And then finally, in-person training sessions through our datathons. So I'm going to close with a few points for reflection. Content curation and preservation is a legacy that we're actively participating in as global digital citizens. We create and interact with an enormous amount of digital data on a daily basis. And as project contributors, no matter what our roles are, we have this amazing opportunity to be able to integrate concepts of access and usability throughout our project development cycles. And for our team, what has been an effective method is coming back to these questions of how does this support access? What are the barriers? What barriers are we creating, and how do we lower them? But also, is this usable? So this mentality of if you build it, they will come needs to be replaced with a more important question of if you design it, will it be usable? Because the value in any tool, method, system is derived from usability. It doesn't matter whether you've created something that has all of the functionality you could ever wish for. If somebody can't use it, it doesn't matter. But usability only exists if it's accessible. So we need to make sure that the bar for both of these concepts are raised on an equal footing. You need to be able you need the ability to make use of something, but you also need for it to have that quality or state of being usable. And so I'm going to finish with this final analogy. Access is like a door that leads into a room, but usability is like that light switch once you enter that room, and you need both. Without that light switch, you're just fumbling around in the dark, you're hitting your foot on that table for the 5th time, it's a disaster. So we need to make sure that access and usability cooperate in partnership. Just a final note on our project. We're really proud to be part of the web archiving community and other communities as well. We acknowledge that our project is the culmination of previous work that has come before us. We draw on expertise and experience of individuals, projects, and institutions from a number of different communities and are truly inspired by the culture and practice shared within the open source community. So as we continue in our final year, I look forward to connecting with all of you and hope to further discussion of how access and usability can be applied within web archives. And I encourage you to explore our tools and platforms. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samantha. So we do have time for questions. I love asking questions, but I don't want to dominate the mic, so somebody else does have to step up eventually. Great. So my question, I'm actually interested if you could talk a little bit more about how you determine accessibility and access. So what tools do you use to work with your community to determine how usable your product is? Like, do you do testing? Do you do community groups?
Yep. So our community started off pretty small. And so our community is both like our user base as well as the larger web archiving community. And so in terms of like testing and just asking about access, it has really come from opportunities like our in-person datathons, which is where this project really started, seeing what are those needs of the researchers, rather than the team saying, okay, this is what researchers need, this is what they wanted, actually asking those research and users and scholars, which also includes librarians and archivists who are dealing with web archive data. We've also done individually for our tools testing as well, just to see, what other usability aspects we can explore to make it more accessible. And one thing that came up a number of times was just, making sure that that documentation was set. Because without it, sometimes, especially with the toolkit, when we're asking people to see that command line, it's really intimidating. So a lot of feedback from the community has been really, really important.
Any other questions? Oh, yep.
Hi. Thanks very much for sharing the range of documentation. I'm really pleased to see learning resources developed. So this is a question I literally wrote down in my notebook to my colleagues. Can you share, so I know there's, datathons and kind of like summit events that have happened. Now that the toolkit and the project has been running for a while, do you have any examples of kind of learning events for those who may be hesitant to start, or now that we're having more and more kind of scholarship centers emerging across the nation? What are some ways to get into it for those researchers who may have heard of archiving the web and want to kind of get into it apart from taking the step-by-step instructions?
Well, I'd say that, right now we're 3 for 4 for our datathons. We do have one coming up in March. That's certainly an opportunity, but just getting involved in some of the, for us, we use Slack. So whether it's with our own Slack channel, whether it's with groups like IIPC and Code for Lib, it seems like there's discussions about web archiving in multiple different communities. And this is as for your question, this is certainly an area that I had a very difficult time when I jumped into this project. I had never heard about web archives. I didn't really know what this field was about. So I also had that question of, oh my gosh, where do I start? What is web archiving and how do I talk to more people? I think it really just comes from looking at different communities. Ours tends to be smaller, but it also branches into other groups. So following our project, following kind of where those other communities are, we're always happy to chat about how our tools work as well. If you don't want to do the step-by-step instructions of how to make it work, if you have a specific question, our team is always happy to collaborate with new users as well.
And likely local advocates or champions, right, who are probably doing that in our community already, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, let's thank Samantha for her great talk.